Margaret never liked silence. Her home was beautiful, filled with family photos and warm furniture. But when her husband Richard left for his 3-week business trip, the house suddenly felt hollow. Richard was reliable, steady, always the one to keep things in order, but his absence left a gap she didn't know how to fill. She thought she would spend the time reading, cooking, and maybe visiting a few friends. But within 2 days, she felt the walls pressing in on her. The house was too quiet, and her heart carried a restless beat she couldn't explain, just when she was beginning to feel lonely. Her daughter called in a rush. Renovations had turned her daughter's home into a maze of tools and dust. And she asked Margaret if she could watch her 10-year-old grandson, Ethan, for a few days. Margaret felt relief at the request. "Of course," she said, her voice brighter than she felt in weeks. Ethan was full of life, talkative, playful, always curious. Having him around would lift the silence. But instead of keeping him in the quiet suburban house, Margaret decided to make the days feel like an adventure. She booked a small seaside hotel in Maine, a place she and Richard had visited years ago. It wasn't grand, but it was charming, with white wooden walls, wide windows that opened to the ocean, and a lobby that smelled of coffee and salt water. Margaret thought it would give Ethan the feeling of a vacation. And secretly, she wanted a change of scenery for herself. The drive up the coast was long but refreshing. Ethan sat in the back seat, chattering about his favorite superheroes, asking questions about the sea, and pointing at passing lighthouses. Margaret smiled at his energy, though her mind wandered often. She remembered the last time she and Richard had stayed near the shore. They were younger then, laughing as they walked along the sand, dreaming of future trips. Time had passed, and their conversations had grown quieter, less about dreams and more about schedules. She shook the thought away and focused on Ethan's laughter. When they arrived at the hotel, the staff greeted them warmly. Ethan ran straight to the lobby fireplace, where he set his toy car racing along the wooden floor. Margaret checked them in, smiling politely, but her attention was pulled elsewhere. Across the room, a man sat in a leather chair, a book resting in his hand. He looked to be in his late 50s, maybe early 60s. His hair touched with gray, his posture calm but slightly weary. There was a stillness about him, the kind that made him seem both present and far away. He glanced up from his book for a moment. Their eyes met, and Margaret felt a curious tug inside her chest. She quickly turned back to Ethan, brushing off the feeling as nothing more than a passing thought. Their room was cozy, with a small balcony that overlooked the sea. Ethan jumped on the bed laughing, while Margaret unpacked their bags. She opened the curtains wide, letting the ocean air drift in. The sound of the waves filled the space, and for the first time since Richard had left, she felt a spark of excitement. This trip wasn't only for Ethan, it was for her too. That evening, they went down for dinner. The hotel's dining room was small, lined with lanterns and decorated with seashells. Ethan insisted on ordering pizza, while Margaret chose grilled salmon. As they ate, Ethan told her about his school friends, his soccer games, and how he wanted to build a robot one day. She listened with patience, her heart swelling with love. Yet, as Ethan kept talking, her eyes drifted across the room. The man she had seen earlier was there again, sitting alone at a corner table with a plate of soup. He wasn't looking at her, but there was something about his solitude that echoed in her heart. She wondered if he, too, was carrying a quiet loneliness. After dinner, Ethan begged to explore the lobby again. Margaret sat on a couch near the fireplace as Ethan played with other children. She tried to read a magazine, but her thoughts wandered. She looked up once more and saw the man again, still reading his book by the fire. The warm light touched his face, and though his expression was calm, his eyes seemed to carry a story. She wondered what kind of book could hold someone's attention so deeply. For a moment, she wanted to ask, but she quickly reminded herself that she was here for Ethan. She folded the thought away, keeping it hidden in a quiet corner of her heart later. When Ethan was finally asleep in their room, Margaret stepped onto the balcony. The night sky stretched wide, filled with stars that shimmered over the black sea. She wrapped her cardigan tightly around her shoulders, listening to the distant waves. A cool breeze brushed against her face, carrying both calm and longing. She thought of Richard, his steady ways, his dependable love. He had given her safety, a life of comfort. Yet as she stood there, her mind returned to the stranger in the lobby. She didn't know his name, but she knew she had noticed him, and that unsettled her. The next morning came quickly. Ethan woke up early, bouncing with excitement to see the beach. They ate breakfast in the hotel's sunny dining hall, Ethan gulping down orange juice while Margaret sipped her coffee slowly. And then it happened again. Her eyes caught the man's. He was sitting at another table reading the morning paper. He looked up briefly, offered a small, polite nod, and returned to his paper. It was nothing more than a moment, yet it left her unsettled. Why did she feel as if a thread had been quietly tied between them? After breakfast, she took Ethan to the shore. The sand was cool under their feet, the water rushing in gentle waves. Ethan ran after seagulls, laughing as they scattered into the sky. Margaret watched him, smiling, but her thoughts wandered again. She didn't know what this trip was trying to teach her, but she could sense it was only the beginning of something she hadn't expected. The morning sun lit the shoreline in soft gold. Margaret held Ethan's hand as they stepped onto the beach, the sand cool under their shoes. Ethan broke free almost immediately, racing toward the water, his laughter carrying over the sound of the waves. Margaret followed at a slower pace, enjoying the salt air filling her lungs. She felt lighter here, far from the silence of her empty home. As she walked, she noticed someone ahead, standing where the tide reached the shore. It was the same man she had seen twice already in the hotel lobby. He stood quietly, hands in his pockets, watching the horizon as if it held answers only he could hear. His calm presence caught her attention before she could stop herself. She considered turning away, but just as she did, Ethan shouted and ran toward a cluster of seashells near the man. Margaret hurried forward, calling Ethan's name. By the time she reached him, Ethan was already speaking to the stranger, proudly showing the shells in his small hands. The man knelt slightly, studying them with genuine interest. "That one's a conch," he said warmly, pointing to the largest shell. His voice was calm, gentle, the kind of tone children trusted right away. Margaret finally reached them, slightly out of breath. "I hope he isn't bothering you," she said quickly. "Not at all," the man replied with a kind smile. "He's got a good eye for details." For a moment their eyes met again. Unlike in the lobby, this time there was space for words. He introduced himself as Daniel from Boston, a retired professor who had come to the coast for a little peace. Margaret hesitated before sharing her own name, but she found herself speaking easily. She told him she was visiting with her grandson while her husband was away. The words came out softer than she expected. It's almost like a confession. Ethan kept running back and forth between the waves, leaving the two adults in a pocket of quiet. Daniel spoke of the ocean, how it helped him think more clearly. He admitted he had lost his wife the year before and that the silence at home had grown unbearable. His honesty startled Margaret, though it explained the sadness she had noticed in his eyes. "I'm sorry," she said gently, and she meant it. There was no need for heavy words. His grief sat between them, unspoken but understood. Daniel smiled faintly. "Life doesn't stop. It just changes. Sometimes I think we're meant to keep learning what it means to live, no matter our age." Margaret nodded, feeling the truth in his words. She thought of her own home, of Richard, of the quiet stretches of their marriage. She wasn't grieving in the same way, but she knew the feeling of silence he described. Something inside her stirred. A recognition of loneliness shared. They walked along the shore together while Ethan ran ahead, chasing waves. Daniel told her about the books he used to teach, the stories that reminded him of the strength of the human spirit. Margaret found herself laughing when he made small jokes about academic life. It felt strange to laugh like that with someone new, but it was refreshing, like a forgotten part of herself waking up at one point. A wave splashed closer than expected, and Margaret's shoes caught the water. She gasped, laughing at the cold, while Daniel offered his hand without thinking. She took it briefly, steadying herself, and in that moment the world felt oddly quiet, as though the sea itself had paused. She pulled her hand back quickly, but the warmth lingered. When they returned to the hotel later that morning, Ethan ran ahead to the lobby, eager to grab a cookie from the refreshment table. Margaret lingered near the entrance, unsure of how to end the conversation. Daniel gave her a polite smile. It's the kind that carried both gratitude and hesitation. Perhaps. I'll see you around, he said. Yes, she replied softly, and then walked away. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. She and Ethan explored a small bookstore in town, ate ice cream, and walked the narrow streets lined with colorful houses. Yet, no matter how busy the day became, Margaret found her thoughts drifting back to the man on the beach. His voice, his gentle eyes, the honesty of his grief, it all replayed in her mind like an unfinished story. She scolded herself quietly. She was a married woman, and she loved Richard. But something about Daniel's presence had unsettled her, leaving a mark she couldn't ignore. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Ethan begged to go downstairs for dessert. They sat at a corner table in the dining room, Ethan devouring chocolate cake while Margaret sipped tea. She tried to focus only on Ethan's happiness, but the moment she lifted her eyes, she saw Daniel across the room. He was alone again, seated near the window, a small notebook open in front of him. Margaret quickly looked away, her heart beating faster than it should. She told herself not to dwell on it. Still, when Ethan asked if they could explore the lobby again after dessert, she agreed, though part of her knew she wanted to see if Daniel would be there too. And he was. Sitting in the same chair by the fireplace, a pen in hand, writing as the firelight flickered across his face. Margaret sat with Ethan nearby, pretending to read the magazine on the table. Though her eyes kept drifting toward Daniel at one point, he looked up and caught her glance. There was no embarrassment, no rush to look away. Just a quiet acknowledgement, a nod that said he saw her too. And in that instant, Margaret felt a spark of connection stronger than before. Later, when Ethan was asleep, Margaret sat on the balcony again, the waves whispering in the night. She couldn't explain what was happening, only that her heart felt restless. She told herself it was nothing, just a coincidence, just a man with kind eyes. But deep down, she knew the truth. Meeting Daniel had awakened something in her she hadn't felt in years. Not desire, not temptation, but the simple longing to be seen, to be understood. And though she didn't yet know where it would lead, she knew the encounter on the beach was only the beginning. The hotel was quiet at night. Ethan had fallen asleep quickly, curled under the blanket with his toy car still in his hand. Margaret sat on the small balcony, looking out at the dark ocean. The waves shimmered faintly under the moonlight, their rhythm steady, almost comforting. Yet her heart was anything but steady. She felt restless, caught between gratitude for her life and a stirring she didn't know how to name. She thought about Richard. He had been her partner for more than 30 years, steady and reliable. The kind of man who never forgot to pay the bills or lock the doors at night. Their marriage had never been fiery, but it was safe, grounded, and steady. Still, in recent years, their conversations had grown shorter, their evenings quieter. She couldn't remember the last time they had laughed until their sides hurt. That thought stung more than she wanted to admit. And then there was Daniel. She barely knew him, yet his presence reminded her of something she had forgotten, the woman she used to be. The one who loved long walks, good books, and deep conversations that stretched late into the night. Around him, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. It wasn't love. It wasn't betrayal. It was something gentler, something she struggled to put into words. The next morning, Ethan woke early, pulling at her arm. "Grandma, can we go for ice cream today?" he asked eagerly. She smiled, ruffling his hair. "Ice cream before lunch. You're a daring boy." But she agreed because his joy was contagious. And she wanted him to have good memories of this trip. When they went downstairs, Margaret spotted Daniel in the lobby. He was reading again, but when he saw them, he put the book aside and smiled. Ethan ran straight to him without hesitation. "Daniel, we're going for ice cream," he announced proudly, as if they had been friends forever. Margaret froze for a moment, unsure of what to say. Daniel chuckled. "Ice cream before lunch. That sounds like a perfect plan." He looked at Margaret, his eyes gentle. "Would you mind if I joined you too?" Her first instinct was to decline. She knew how delicate this felt. But Ethan tugged at her sleeve, his face bright with excitement. "Please, Grandma, please." She hesitated only a moment before nodding. "All right." Just ice cream. The three of them walked to a small shop down the street. Ethan ordered chocolate with sprinkles, his face lighting up with each bite. Daniel ordered vanilla, while Margaret chose strawberry, the flavor she hadn't picked in years. They sat by the window, sunlight streaming over the table. Conversation flowed easily. Daniel spoke about books he loved, funny stories from his years of teaching, and little details about Boston life. Margaret found herself laughing again, the sound surprising her. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed like this. At one point, Daniel asked her, "What about you, Margaret? What do you love to do just for yourself?" The question startled her. She paused, realizing she didn't know how to answer. For years, her life had revolved around her family, her home, and Richard's routine. She had stopped asking herself that question long ago. "I used to love painting," she admitted softly, "but I haven't picked up a brush in years." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You should. Sometimes the things we leave behind are the very things that keep us alive." His words stayed with her. Even as Ethan chattered about soccer and superheroes, Margaret's mind kept returning to that thought. She had let pieces of herself slip away, not out of sadness, but simply out of habit. And now, sitting across from Daniel, she wondered if it was too late to reclaim them. Later that day, as Ethan napped upstairs, Margaret walked alone to the hotel's small garden. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of roses. She sat on a bench, watching the flowers sway in the breeze. To her surprise, Daniel appeared, walking slowly along the path. He saw her and stopped, as if unsure whether to continue. Then, with a polite smile, he approached. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said gently. "Not at all," she replied. Though her heart raced, they sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind rustle through the leaves. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable earlier, but I can see there's more to you than you let on. Sometimes we forget we're more than the roles we play." Margaret's eyes stung. No one had said words like that to her in years. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," she admitted. "I love my husband. I'm grateful for the life we've built. But sometimes I feel like I've disappeared in it." Daniel looked at her kindly. "You haven't disappeared. You're right here. Maybe you just need someone to remind you." She couldn't answer. Her heart was too full, too conflicted. She stood after a moment, smoothing her dress. "I should get back to Ethan." That night, she found it hard to sleep. Ethan was snoring softly beside her, but Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling. She felt torn between two worlds, the safe, steady life she had built with Richard and the unexpected spark of recognition she had found with Daniel. She wasn't in love with Daniel, she told herself firmly, but he had opened a window inside her, and the fresh air rushing in was impossible to ignore. The following day, Daniel invited them to walk the town together. Ethan begged her to say yes. Margaret hesitated, but the truth was she wanted to go. They strolled through narrow streets, browsed local shops, and stopped at a cafe for lemonade. Everything felt simple, almost ordinary, yet beneath it all, Margaret sensed the weight of something deeper as the afternoon sun dipped lower. They paused by the harbor, watching boats drift in. Ethan leaned against the railing, humming to himself. Daniel stood close to Margaret, not touching, but near enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "Life gives us moments," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "Some we keep, some we let pass. The important thing is to recognize them when they come." Margaret's throat tightened. She didn't answer, but she knew she would remember those words long after she left the hotel that evening. Back in her room, she sat by the window long after Ethan had gone to bed. The stars glittered above the sea, the waves whispering softly below. She felt both grateful and guilty. She hadn't crossed any line, but she couldn't deny that her heart had stirred in ways she hadn't expected. She pressed her hand against her chest, whispering to herself, "What am I doing?" But deep down, she already knew. She was standing on the edge of two lives, the one she had always known, and the one she had just discovered still existed inside her. The last evening at the hotel came too quickly. The days had passed in a blur of beach walks, small-town adventures, and quiet conversations. Margaret had not planned any of this. The trip was meant to be about giving Ethan a fun memory while Richard was away. Yet here she was, sitting by the fireplace in the hotel lobby with Daniel beside her, feeling as if something inside her had quietly shifted. Ethan was playing nearby, building a tower of blocks with another child he had befriended. The warm crackle of the fire filled the silence between them. Margaret held a cup of tea, her hands wrapped tightly around it as though the warmth might steady her. Daniel broke the quiet. "I'm glad I met you," he said simply. His voice was calm, without pressure or expectation, but his words sank deep. Margaret looked at him, unsure how to reply. She wanted to say she felt the same, but the weight of her marriage, of her years with Richard, held her tongue. "It's been unexpected," she managed at last. Daniel nodded as though he understood the words she hadn't spoken. Life is full of unexpected turns. Some stay with us, some pass. But either way, they remind us that we're still alive. His words echoed in her heart. She thought of the years she had spent moving through her routines, never questioning the quiet distance that had grown between her and Richard. She loved him, yes, but somewhere along the way, love had turned into habit. Meeting Daniel had reminded her that her heart was still capable of longing, of being moved. The firelight flickered across his face, and for a moment, Margaret wondered what might have been if life had placed them in each other's path earlier. The thought scared her. She wasn't searching for another life, but she couldn't deny the ache of the possibility. Ethan's laughter broke her thoughts, grounding her again. She smiled at her grandson, grateful for his innocence. Then she turned back to Daniel. "I'll be leaving tomorrow," she said softly, the words heavier than she expected. "I know," he replied. He looked down at his notebook resting on the table, then back at her. "But maybe that's how it's meant to be. Some meetings are short, but they stay with us longer than we imagine." The simplicity of his words made her chest tighten. She nodded, unable to speak, afraid her voice would betray the emotions she was holding back. Later that night, back in her room, Margaret tucked Ethan into bed and sat again on the balcony. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, waves rolling with steady rhythm. She thought of Richard, of the man she had promised her life to. He had never failed her. He had given her security, a family, a home. She owed him loyalty, but more than that, she owed him honesty, if not in words, then in effort. She realized then that the ache she carried wasn't about Daniel alone. It was about her marriage, about the silence she had allowed to settle in. Daniel had reminded her of what she was missing, not another man, but connection, attention, the feeling of being truly seen. It wasn't betrayal she feared. It was forgetting who she was inside her own life. The next morning, Margaret packed their bags while Ethan bounced with excitement, ready to head home. As they carried their things to the lobby, she saw Daniel one last time. He was standing near the entrance, his suitcase beside him. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, both knowing words could never capture what they felt. Daniel stepped closer, his expression gentle. "Take care of yourself, Margaret. And don't forget to paint again." The mention of painting startled her. She had almost forgotten she had said that to him, but the way he remembered it felt like a gift. She smiled, though her eyes stung. "Thank you for reminding me." He hesitated, then reached for her hand. He held it briefly, not in romance, but in quiet respect. The warmth of his touch stayed with her as he let go. No promises, no future, just a moment carved into memory. Ethan tugged at her arm, eager to go. Margaret gave Daniel one last nod before walking away. She didn't look back, though her heart wanted to. The drive home was filled with Ethan's chatter. He talked about seashells, ice cream, and the tower of blocks he had built in the lobby. Margaret smiled, responding when she could, but inside her thoughts were far away. She knew she would never forget Daniel. He had stepped into her life briefly, like a wave that touched the shore and then receded, leaving patterns in the sand. When Richard returned from his business trip, Margaret greeted him at the door. He looked tired but relieved to be home. She hugged him longer than usual, surprising him. He chuckled, brushing it off, but she held on tightly. She realized she didn't need to tell him about Daniel. That wasn't the lesson she had brought back. What mattered was the reminder that love should not be left unattended, that marriage needed tending like a garden or it would fall silent. That night, as they sat together at the dinner table, she asked Richard about his trip, really listening to his stories. He seemed surprised by her interest, his eyes softening in a way she hadn't seen in a long time. Margaret knew then that she had a choice to let life drift quietly or to bring life back into their love. In the weeks that followed, she bought a set of paints and brushes. At first her strokes were shaky, uncertain, but soon colors began to bloom across the canvas. Richard noticed and asked her about it, and for the first time in years, she spoke to him not as his wife, but as herself, sharing her dreams again. She never saw Daniel again, but she didn't need to. His presence had done what it was meant to do. He had awakened something in her, a reminder that she was more than her roles, more than the silence that had settled around her. She carried his words with her, not as a secret, but as a guide. Some meetings stay with us longer than we imagine, and every time she picked up a paintbrush, every time she laughed with Richard again, she silently thanked the man she met by the ocean, the stranger who reminded her that her heart was still alive.